So I do want to start tonight. Let's start with what unfolded in Syria, what has been unfolding in that country over the past couple of years. This is an important story for all of us to consider. For those of you who think that the U.S. can support sides of a conflict with impunity, thanks to the U.S.-led proxy war in Syria, Syrian citizens are starving, their towns destroyed. It could take generations to rebuild this country. We're very lucky tonight to have a special guest with us, Vanessa Beeley. She's an independent journalist, one of the finest journalists in the world. If you're not following her work, you absolutely should. We need more of her in this world. She is joining us from Damascus, Syria tonight. It's very late over there right now, so we want to be respectful of your time and get you out of here on a decent hour. Vanessa, great to have you back here on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Your work is really what's the best way to describe it? Like brave, and there's they're literally shining a light where we need it most. And there's just there's very few of people like you doing the work that you're doing. So I really, really mean that from the bottom of my heart. So you and I were communicating earlier today as we look at what's unfolding with Syria. And of course, last night, the United Nations failed to reach this compromise that would have basically extended this, quote, humanitarian aid for another year. So let's unpack this story. It's complicated. It's important. And if you read the Western media, you will be lied to and you will not get an accurate assessment of actually what's going on there. So what happened yesterday?
Well, yesterday, basically, first of all, I would not call this Syria aid. I would call it aid for Al-Qaeda. And of course, Al-Qaeda has been described by Jake Sullivan and Ambassador Jeffries as an asset to the US in Syria in their mission to overthrow the legitimate Syrian government. President was re-elected in May 2021. With an overwhelming majority. Whether you believe in that majority or not, he is supported by the majority of the Syrian people. So what happened was effectively very much as the last time that there was a vote in the UN Security Council over the establishment or the maintenance of the last remaining official humanitarian border crossing at Bab al-Hawa between Turkey and Syria. Western media would have you believe that Russia completely criminally prevented or vetoed this humanitarian aid crossing. But this is where the context needs to come in. Bab al-Hawa is controlled exclusively by Al-Qaeda. So whenever you see American officials visiting Bab al-Hawa, they won't enter Syria, but they'll go to the Bab al-Hawa crossing and they'll do photo shoots with the white helmets and various other alleged officials at Bab al-Hawa to push the fact that they want this humanitarian crossing kept open. Why do they want it kept open? Because it provides essential revenue for their asset in Syria, which is Al-Qaeda. And you have to combine this, of course, with the organization established by Al-Qaeda called WATAD, W-A-T-A-D, that has monopoly over the processing of Syrian oil that is stolen directly by the United States coalition and its proxies, which include the Kurdish Contras and ISIS. I mean, that's another point to come on to. So effectively, it's in the US coalition interest to keep this humanitarian corridor open. It provides revenue for Al-Qaeda. It provides an entry point for weapons to the armed groups established in Idlib and that control Idlib, dominated by Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the latest rebranding of Al-Qaeda to try and sort of distance it from its terrorist identity in Western public opinion. So effectively what Russia is doing here, it's trying to minimize the amount of time that this border is extended each time, and it's also calling for 2 monthly briefings on what the humanitarian corridor is being used for, which is utterly correct. But what Russia is also trying to do, of course, is to enable the return of all Syrian territory to the control of the legitimate government in Damascus. So the other half of Russia's proposal, apart from reducing it from 12 months to 6 months, to enable evaluation and not to enable this crossing to be extended to a point where it has potential to enable the armed groups to carry out a new aggression, for example, against the Syrian Arab Army positions in southern Idlib. But also what Russia is trying to do is to establish humanitarian aid coming from Damascus to secure points on the border of Idlib to then be transported into Idlib. So effectively giving the control back to the Damascus government rather than to Turkey and to the UN, which of course the UN is effectively an extension of US coalition power anywhere in the world, but particularly in Syria. So Russia's role really is to clamp down on terrorist activities, terrorist revenue, income of or incoming weapons. And of course, we know that many of the weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine are ending up in Syria via the dark web. So it's a very real danger at the moment that some of the more sophisticated weapons that are ostensibly being sent into the Ukrainian army are being picked up and brought into Syria, into Idlib, readying the terrorist groups there, again, as I keep repeating, dominated by Al-Qaeda. As Brett McGurk said, Brett McGurk, that's the word. It's late.
I was going to say, we'll forgive you. Yeah. It's almost midnight in Syria where you are. So
yeah, and I get up at 5 most days, so my brain starts to kind of freeze at this time. I apologize. It's the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. Wow. So that gives you some of the background that you're simply not going to be told by Western media, who will use this as another opportunity to criminalize Russia.
Right, that's exactly what we saw today, right? So most headlines for Western media consumers said that Russia blocked aid to Syria because it is just a straight evil thing to do, and that's what Russia wants to do. When in fact, Russia and China put forth another measure which would only allow this continuation for 6 months and then a new supply route to be established, and that was vetoed by everyone else, right? And so why, I mean, you went into it a little bit. You said that the United Nations is an extension of the United States and their wish list, right? But why would the media then care to report it in that way?
Well, I mean, I think I've said it quite often. I think Western media now is actually even more brazenly than before an extension of intelligence, security, military agencies, government agencies, and it simply follows the roadmap of whatever government is in power at the time. We've seen that. We went from Obama to Trump to Biden, and effectively the roadmap in Syria has not changed. The methods of imposing that roadmap have changed marginally, but the media has consistently supported whatever the foreign policy is of whatever government is in power in the United States. And also more directly now is proving itself to be controlled, particularly in the UK. I follow UK media. BBC, for example, is proving itself to be really nothing more than an extension. They're becoming hitmen for intelligence agencies now, nothing more than that.
Yeah, and you and I talked and I would encourage all of our viewers to go and watch. You and I had a deeper conversation in our Redacted Conversations piece where we spent about an hour talking about both Syria and China. The BBC's hit piece there on China was remarkable. Yeah. So yes, we're seeing that in the Western media. You sent out a Telegram message on this, and I thought that this was poignant. This new Los Angeles Times piece from like 2016, which was already a few years old at the time, but I want you to contextualize this for us. It says, in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. So for viewers watching right now that don't understand, we were literally funding and providing arms to both sides.
Right. In fact, this Los Angeles Times article talks about how there's sort of a clash of three sides, right? The internal fighting plus the uprising against the Assad government, and that how that made it difficult for the United States, which was funding two different conflicts. We knew that at the time. We seem to have forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there continues even now to be a clash between intelligence agencies and military agencies, for example, whether it's UK or US. they're each backing different factions inside Syria as a supposed alternative to, again, I say it, the legitimate government in Damascus. So you're getting clashes between, for example, factions like HTS, which is Al-Qaeda, used to be Nusra Front, and, for example, groups like al-Sham. Al-Sham now are more heavily backed by Turkey, for example. So I tend to see it, rather than seeing them as terrorist groups, I tend to see them as mafia organizations that are being controlled by different bosses and are looking to achieve status and power and financial gain, etc., territory, and recognition on an international stage. So they're all vying for power within, as you pointed out, the war to remove the Syrian government and to secure resources, including oil and water and natural gas, hydrocarbons, etc., which Syria is rich in, and also to steal the agricultural abundance in Syria, both through their terrorist proxies, but also directly again. You know, the US is responsible for the burning, particularly under the Trump administration, of swathes of wheat and barley agricultural lands. And
Yes.
all of this comes down to the isolation of a central Syria, surrounded on almost all borders by either the US coalition and proxies or by Turkey and the terrorist groups that Turkey is controlling. And coming back to the humanitarian corridor, I myself went, I think it was last year, to Afrin, which is on the front lines with Idlib. So it's one of the last villages before under the control of the Syrian army. And that was established, that line was established during, by the Russia-Turkish brokered ceasefire. At that front line, we were being attacked by weapons supplied by the US. How can I say that? Or manufactured in the US, right? Because I was presented with unexploded missiles that had targeted us.
Wow.
Targeted us because surveillance was provided by Turkey. So that is how complex this conflict is, only in Idlib, only in this northwesterly corner. And that's why Russia is trying to play a kind of very complex, very intelligent game here to try and limit the amount of incoming weapons, soldiers, terrorists through the Bab al-Hawa crossing. And the UN is perfectly well aware of what goes on at Bab al-Hawa. It's impossible that it isn't. US officials that visit there are perfectly well aware of what is going on. So they are effectively protecting US coalition assets by wanting the humanitarian crossing kept open for longer periods with less checks and balances on how it's being managed. Russia is saying, no, we want it for shorter periods of time and we want better controls on what is coming in and how it is being distributed to civilians, because that's another thing. Al-Qaeda, and they've done this throughout all the occupied zones that they controlled, they store the goods, the humanitarian aid that is coming in, and then they sell it. They trade it at extortionate prices to those civilians. So very often civilians are left without anything, but it's always portrayed as being the fault of Russia or the Syrian government, whereas in reality, the Syrian government and Russia are trying to find alternative mechanisms that will ensure that the Syrian people, the genuine Syrian people and refugees, receive the humanitarian aid. And of course, what Russia is also trying to do is to break the sanction block on the Syrian government protected areas of Syria, which is this internal 85%, because if the aid is going to come from Damascus, then that means the UN is going to have to up its delivery of humanitarian aid to Damascus to enable the delivery to Idlib, if you understand what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Right now, under sanctions, much of that humanitarian aid that is entering Idlib is never sent to the people in the Syrian government-controlled areas because sanctions.
Yes.
So they're punishing the human beings, the Syrian civilians, in the central Syria,
right,
because they've supported their elected government while they're enabling and facilitating revenue for Al-Qaeda and weapons supply to Al-Qaeda in the northwest. I mean, it's utterly reprehensible.
And
what
Syria
Russia is trying to do is to point this out in a very diplomatic way, right?
Right.
I've actually heard today they have extended now for 6 months, so they finally accepted the Russian proposal.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's the update
great. Well,
then.
that's great news. But at
Yeah.
least, but will any of that aid actually get to the people? If you're just joining us, we're joined by amazing journalist Vanessa Beeley, and independent journalist who is in Damascus, Syria, covering this. Has been covering this conflict for years. So, what will happen to the Syrian people? I mean, this is ultimately the question, right?
Yes, because they don't have the benefit of, a superstar conflict right now. So it is not as if there are countries that are crowdfunding aid for Syria, right? All of that sort of popularity contest is going to Ukraine right now. And we see that with Syrian refugees being shoved to the back of so many refugee lines. But is this the only hope that Syrian people have for aid, which is just government and government organizations?
No, I mean, look, Syria has survived 11 years of one of the most sort of protracted and vicious wars of attrition, hybrid wars. So military war, economic war, diplomatic war, media war, some of the most unprecedented and barbaric sanctions, particularly brought in under Trump, under the Caesar law. But of course, they have also very strong allies. They have Iran, they have Russia. I mean, we recently had a delivery of, I think it was 20 million barrels of oil from Iran, 2 tankers from Iran docked in Banyas, which is on the Mediterranean coast. Russia also has been very supportive. What people also don't understand, and it's maybe worth pointing out, because people do tend to call out Russia and say, well, why isn't Russia doing more? Why isn't China doing more? The reason that Russia and China are not publishing what they're doing for Syria is because they will get stung by sanctions. Remember that the Caesar Act sanctions penalize any country that comes to the assistance of Syria. I mean, this is one of the most absolutely illegitimate criminal mandates ever brought in my opinion, because it not only sanctions the people of Syria, but it sanctions any country that will come to the aid of the people of Syria, right? So it's a double whammy here. So Russia and China keep everything.
Who put
that was brought in under President Trump, and that was brought in under the Caesar Act, which was based on a totally discredited Caesar report, which began back in 2018 from memory. I could be wrong on that. But that was brought in. The Caesar sanctions were brought in under the Trump administration. And under the Trump administration, the majority of the crops and the agricultural land was effectively scorched, right? And then Biden came in, and Biden immediately started bombing the Iraqi-Syria border, which is one of the few entry points for trade between Iraq and Syria, and also one of the few areas where the PMU, the Popular Mobilization units or forces, gather in order to protect the border against ISIS. So again, the US is effectively bombing those that are fighting ISIS in Syria.
Wow.
And I guess, one last question is on this this oil. The U.S. has about 2,000 troops that are apparently, they say, guarding Syrian oil, guarding for the protection of the Syrians, I suppose. And so the aid can't reach the Syrian people. The oil, their very own oil, is being guarded by the United States. What do the Syrian people think of what the United States is doing there?
Well, I mean, if you come to Syria, there is not one Syrian that will not explain to you fully what has been going on here for decades, which is effectively CIA and MI6 interference in their state affairs since Syrian independence in 1946 from the French mandate. America or the United States may claim it only has 2,000 troops, but of course it manages more than 5,000 ISIS terrorist fighters that are kept in holding camps and are then maneuvered around by the United States to carry out isolated attacks against Syrian Arab army positions, civilian infrastructure, both in Syria and in Iraq, by the way. They attack electrical power stations in Iraq also. And then, of course, the Kurdish separatists, the Kurdish Contras that are, again, in the pay of the United States. So while there are only 2,000 US troops, they also have at their beck and call the Kurdish Contras and ISIS terrorist fighters, both of whom have benefited from the oil revenue over the time that they have ethnically cleansed and settled in that region. And actually, Victoria Nuland recently stated a US intention to build settlements onto the northeastern territory of Syria. So effectively, the US is now officially trying to annex Syrian territory, and Syrian territory, which of course contains the majority of the oil resources. But also for people to understand, Turkey has control, it has total hydro hegemony. It has control of the water sources, particularly to the northeast, but also to the north and northwest, even to Aleppo. And it can cut those water supplies at any time, and it has done that in Hasaka. So it's deprived 2 million people of water in the northeast in Hasaka. So you have the absolute piracy of Syrian resources on all levels, agricultural, water, oil.
So, good. The United States is going to annex Syria and set up another state there. But they won't give them states' rights. It'll become a territory, and it'll just unbelievable. Just as I'm going through data on Guam and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and you think about all of the territories that the United States has annexed over the years, and of course, just makes you sick to your stomach to think what's happening there.
You know, I have noticed, this is just something I notice when I don't have enough historical context for something, I go to Amazon and I say, oh, I wonder if there's a book I can read. But this is something where books on the Syrian conflict do seem to me suppressed by search results. And
that's not a conspiracy theory.
And I, you know, of course, I wonder, is that me? Is that something to do with my cookies or what have you? So I'm going to ask you for a recommendation of something that I can, because, you know, we hear all of the time, all of the propaganda around Assad and that type of thing that comes out of the Western media. So can you tell me anything that you suggest to read that's more along the lines of this? What you just told me, that Syrian people say that CIA and MI6 interfere and have been since the 1946 independence. Is there more context we can get about that?
Or are Natalie's cookies
give me homework?
Are Natalie's cookies just totally stale? She's not going to
Could be that.
There are a couple of books. One I would recommend, which might sound a bit Patrick Seal is a very good author, and I'm desperately trying to remember the name of his book, but he spent a lot of time with Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad. So if you look up Patrick Seal in Syria, you'll find the title of the book, and I apologize that I can't remember.
Well, there's
it off
one
the top
called
of my
The
head.
Struggle for Syria, and there's just Assad as well. Okay.
Anyway, both, there's another one by an American academic called David Lesch, Lesch, and that is called The New Lion of Damascus. Now, what's really interesting about this book was this was written pre-2009 or maybe around 2009. And I always challenge people to find any international criticism of President Assad prior to 2009 when he turned down the Qatari US-backed pipeline in favor of the Iranian-Russia pipeline. And David Lesch wrote this book at the kind of watershed moment. So it's actually a very positive review of the president's reformist progressive presidency. So it's worth reading. He did do a complete flip in 2012. I would argue that that was influenced by US foreign policy at that time. He won't actually engage on that subject, so I can't talk for David Lesh, but that would be my opinion on it. Another very good book is Stephen Gowan's Washington's Long War on Syria, and that gives you quite a lot of the history that I've talked about that goes back to 1946. It goes before that, but I've written about from 1946 until 2011 because I just found it absolutely horrific and kind of fascinating that the CIA has interfered from day one.
Yeah.
And carried out successive regime changes and coup d'etat and covert military exercises to influence policies in Syria. Syria is essential to the United States. Who controls the Middle East controls Eurasia.
Right.
that was said in Brzezinski's book, right?
Right.
And no other nation is more at the center of the Middle East than Syria. It's the hub of everything. It's the hub of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the hub of Assad's 5Cs project. But it's for America, for the United States, it's the prize in the Middle East, okay? Because it gives them control over Eurasia, and that's what they want essentially. That's why Russia. The wars against, or the interventions against Syria have always been to prize them apart from the Soviet Union and from Russia.
We had a question here. I wanted to get you out of here and let you get some bedtime
No
because
worries.
it's almost midnight there in Syria where you are. One of our viewers just asked in the chat here, what happens to the oil that the U.S. controls in Syria? What happens to that oil? We just heard that President Biden, sold off the United States strategic oil reserves to China in part. So what happens to the oil that's in Syria that the United States is guarding?
A lot of it actually ends up in Israel, traded. So it's traded out previously by ISIS, now by the Kurds, the Kurdish separatists. But it's the U.S. that transports the oil, by the way, out of Syria into Iraq. Then we assume some of it goes to Al-Qaeda, as I said, for processing, and then that's sold into Turkey. But I think it was Erdogan's son-in-law that was involved in the sale of Syrian oil to Israel historically. So I'm assuming it's still being hiked off to Israel, I would assume.
Well, one of our viewers says, yes, Vanessa Beeley live, most excellent. So that's what Brutally Remastered says in our chat right now. Yes, you are watching Vanessa Beeley joining us here on Redacted. We were just talking about some books that you should read on Syria. I would also encourage all of you to follow Vanessa on Telegram. That's where she's most active, I would say, posting over there routinely on her journalism, one of the best journalists in the world. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us. Really appreciate you being here on the show tonight.
No, thank you for getting me on to clarify that. I think it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa, and make sure all of you go and subscribe to her on Telegram. Thanks again to Vanessa's excellent journalism. We'll have her back again real soon. Thank you so much for subscribing to our channel. We've been banned, we've been blocked, we've been censored. That's why we started our own website to stay connected with you for free.
That's right. So head on over to redacted.inc and make sure you're connected with us. You can sign up again at redacted.inc, not .com.